Welcome, fellow beekeepers. This is Jamie Walters, your live webinar training host. I'm pleased to share this educational webinar in hopes to make you a better beekeeper. Live sessions are now recorded on the fourth Sunday of each month at 7 o'clock p.m. through Zoom conference call. You're welcome to reserve a ticket at www.eventbrite.com. Search for Ohio State Beekeepers Association's events and click Tickets. Register by filling in your name and email address, and a confirmation email will be sent to you with a Zoom link. Each training session is recorded and posted on OSBA's YouTube channel. You're welcome to subscribe and be sure to click the bell to be alerted each time we upload a new video. Each month's speaker and presentation will be posted on OSBA's Facebook page and on our website at ohiostatebeekeepers.org. You're welcome to subscribe to the live webinar training news group to be alerted at the beginning of each month. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at live-webinar-training@ohiostatebeekeepers.org. And now on to our previous recorded webinar.
My name is Cameron Jack. I am a lecturer and a researcher at the University of Florida, and I'm very honored and grateful that I can speak to such a great state organization, and I really appreciate you inviting me to do this. In this talk today, I just wanted to cover some of the basics of Varroa biology. I realize that there are probably some of you that have been beekeepers for many years, and you know all about Varroa, and I don't need to hammer too many points there. But I also recognize that there's probably some new beekeepers to the group, and so I'm going to try to give a little bit of information that hopefully will be interesting for all different groups. I also have done quite a bit of work with oxalic acid specifically, with the management of Varroa, and so I thought I would share a little bit about my own work as well. So kind of going into this and beginning, I wanted to just introduce myself a little bit further, because there's probably a lot of you that don't know me, but I'm originally from a small town in southern Nevada that's just northeast of Las Vegas. It's just called Moapa Valley or Logandale, and this little town, you know, is out in the desert. It's just hot. It's crazy dry. I show this image to beekeepers in Florida, and there's just an audible gasp in the room, and people just can't believe that we could do any kind of agriculture, especially bees out there when it's 120 degrees in the summer. So different kind of beekeeping, for sure. And I have grown up with some beekeeping roots. My grandpa was a high school principal, but he was a sideliner and supplemented his income through beekeeping and managed about 100 to 200 colonies in a year. And he would have to move his bees out of the desert during the intense heat in order for them to make honey and be productive. So you'd go to the mountains of southern Utah. But this was, as a kid, this wasn't really a passion of mine. This was kind of just a weird thing that my family did. But as I got a little bit older and went off to school and started to think about research and my interest in research, I started to get in touch again with my beekeeping roots and really fell back in love with it. And just to kind of show you, not just beekeeping, but also the extension and the public outreach of beekeeping is also just been a part of my life growing up. And I'm so thrilled that I get to continue to do that. So that's a little bit about me. Let's talk now about the reason we're maybe so many of us are struggling or might be attending this conference specifically, or this web series, because of this stinking little pest here, Varroa destructor. Now, Varroa, if you're unfamiliar, this is a mite, and this is it was originally thought and purported for a long time to have been feeding on the hemolymph, which is the bee's blood, and thereby transmitting viruses. But some recent evidence has shown that they are probably more likely feeding on fat bodies, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But something important to know about Varroa is that you can notice their large size. Of course, this is still pretty small for us, but in regards to a honeybee, this is actually one of the largest ectoparasite to host ratios that we even know. And this mite has caused havoc throughout the world for many years. With It's been in the United States for over 30 years, and we're still struggling to control this pesky pest. So, where did this mite come from anyways? Well, we received Varroa we first discovered Varroa in the United States in 1987. But it was first discovered to be on Apis mellifera in 1952. Now, Varroa has been long since a part of Apis cerana's life, right? Its original host is the Asian honeybee Apis cerana, but once beekeepers in Eastern Europe Eastern Russia and China, they started importing Apis mellifera colonies. And once you kind of start overlapping those geographical areas, then it really lends itself to having these it lends itself to sharing each other's pests and diseases. So once we started to discover this in the 50s, throughout Eastern Russia and through China, then about the 70s, we see it show up in Europe. And then kind of a short time after that, it just started spreading all over the United States. So we actually had quite a bit of a heads up. We knew this was coming, and yet we still were really caught off guard with how difficult this mite was, and how difficult it is to control. So there has been some more recent discovery, which is kind of a basic biology, and I'm sure many of you that have been paying attention have heard this already. But there was some work done out of the University of Maryland a couple years ago that kind of shed some new light on Varroa biology, and what they found was that Varroa are more likely to be feeding on the fat tissues rather than the hemolymph. Now, ultimately, that doesn't mean a lot, right? I mean, just knowing that doesn't change anything in the short term, but in the long term, this could have some important implications to the way that we have been going about controlling the pest. Also thinking about, one of the research topics that I've been interested in is trying to rear Varroa like as a colony inside the lab, which if you think of any other insect pest, that's what they do. I mean, even mosquitoes, they rear them in the lab so they can do year-round studies on the pest. But there's nothing like that for Varroa. They're so difficult once you separate them from the bee. So, I mean, this little piece of work was, as in my eyes, is very convincing. I mean, basically what they did was they flash froze a bee with a mite on it, and then they looked to see where these mites were. And guess what? They happened to be in a location that happens to have a lot of honeybee fat bodies. But probably the most simple and easiest explanation is when they could look at what they did was they fed some honeybees two different kinds of dye. They fed them a dye that would stain their hemolymph yellow, and a dye that would stain their fat tissues red. And then they put a bunch of mites on them, and then they looked to see what colors were showing up in the mites. And here you can plainly see that these mites are turning red, right? That means they're primarily feeding on honeybee fat tissues. So like I said, again, that doesn't have a lot of short-term implications, but scientifically, this is pretty important kind of going forward. And I'm looking forward to future developments. But really, just because Varroa are feeding on the honeybee fat tissues, that doesn't really mean very much. Really, even to the honeybees. I mean, they're pretty robust. They could probably handle that. What really becomes a problem with Varroa feeding on honeybees is the fact that they are now transmitting lots of viruses, and there are lots of viruses inside your honeybee colonies already. It's not necessarily that Varroa are introducing new viruses. your colony, I hate to break it to you, your colonies are already riddled with viruses. And so once you start having high Varroa infestations, then those virus levels in your colony really start to increase. And that's what causes your colony, generally speaking, to collapse. Now, Varroa biology is really is like I said, it's very difficult to replicate this in the lab, but it's also just really important that you understand how their basic reproduction works, because a lot of the control measures that we use against Varroa have to do with disrupting their control or their reproduction. So just really simply from this figure, I'll show you that the very first mite that enters into a cell is called a foundress. And this is always going to be a female. And what she'll do is she will bury herself underneath the larva and submerge herself in the brood food. And these mites, along not just Varroa, but really there's a whole family of these types of mites that will have something called a peritreme. This is an organ that basically kind of acts like a snorkel. It allows them to be submerged in liquid, but they can still breathe. And so they can hang out here for quite some time. And then once the larva is ready to be capped, it's giving off this pheromone, and the workers are capping that cell, and then they will eat the rest of their brood food and then stand up on end like in the prepupal phase, and now the mite is free to move about the cabin. And the mite can start feeding on the pupa. It will start laying eggs, and they'll continue to lay eggs about every 30 hours or so. And that first egg will always develop into a male, and then every subsequent egg will develop into a female. And so this is really interesting biology here. You've got a male son who will then mate with all the female daughters. And that's the only mating that they will do for the rest of their life. And it's with their brother. So there's a tremendous amount of inbreeding that goes on within Varroa biology, but there must be some more factors at play that we might not have a great understanding about yet, because they're not turning blue, they're not growing extra limbs. They've seemed to have it, figured out somewhat. But the timing of before the mite or before the bee exits that cell is really important, because there are some mites that are going to stay behind. All the immatures are going to stay behind in the cell and they're going to die. Also, the male mites are also going to stay inside the cell and die. So you're not going to see the male Varroa walking around. And this figure kind of shows this nicely. If you have a worker brood, so by the time that it is capped and then there's one female inside that cell, within that 12-day period that it takes for a worker to fully develop and to exit that cell, you can have one female foundress go in, and then you could have two fully mated, ready, sexually mature daughters kind of come out. And then they're actually, Varroa are actually more partial to drone brood, and there's probably a very good reason for this. If there are lots of drones in the colony, you can expect that there will also be lots of mites heading for that drone larva. And it's because they have 3 extra days of development. And that 3 extra days actually pays big dividends for these mites. If you have these 3 extra days, you have one female foundress goes in and you have 5 fully mature daughters that can come out of that cell. So when there's lots of drones in the colony, that's when you tend to see Varroa populations spike. Now, there's also some very seasonal effects on Varroa population growth, and it all has to do with their ability to reproduce. So let's look at this blue line here first. This figure, by the way, is not my own. This is from the Honeybee Health Coalition, which is they have a tools for Varroa management guide that is free, that I absolutely recommend you check out. It's very well done and a really useful resource. But there is, if we're looking at this blue line here, this is our bee population. You can see that, in the winter, you're in your dormant phase. And then let's say our spring is coming, our population is increasing. We get into maybe early summer, midsummer, when we hit that population peak. And then as expected, once you hit in the fall, that queen slows down her laying, and the population is going to decrease again. Well, now, knowing what we know about Varroa biology and their reproduction, let's look at what we expect to happen with the mite population. So it might be high at first, but then those population numbers are going to decrease as we kind of get through the winter. But once the honeybee population starts to increase, then our mite population is also increasing. And what makes it really dangerous for Varroa, or what makes Varroa really dangerous, is especially in the fall. Because here in the fall now is when our honeybee population is decreasing, but guess what? There's still enough brood inside of the colony for Varroa to continue to increase. And it's usually at this point when it becomes really deadly, when those viruses are at all-time highs. There's not enough bees inside the colony to handle or really absorb all this high virus load, and that's when colonies crash. So it's important for you to be aware of that so that you can plan accordingly as a beekeeper. So one of the ways that we can arm ourselves with knowledge and plan ahead is to monitor. And you know, I really hate to kind of be so pessimistic about this, but the good old days of beekeeping where you could just set out your colonies and you could just, you know, go harvest honey from them, you know, a couple times a year and just basically leave them and let them do their own thing. I mean, those days are, unfortunately, I feel, are gone. I mean, you have to be a proactive beekeeper or you won't be a beekeeper for very long. You know, so we can be proactive and we can be paying attention to our Varroa populations through monitoring efforts. And the feeling used to be that you needed to monitor maybe twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. And really, I mean, what most people are suggesting now is that you are monitoring at least every other month. I would say during the production season, this should be like a monthly checkup on your hives, just to see how their Varroa populations are doing. And, you know, a lot of people will come back to me and say, well, Cameron, I know I'm going to have to treat. I need to treat for the timing of the nectar flow. And I get that. That's totally understandable. But what people often don't do, so they have this idea that, like, well, I don't need to check because I'm going to treat anyways. But what you don't know is that sometimes your treatments are not effective, right? So this is especially important to continue to monitor, especially before and after treatment, so you know what your treatment efficacy is, because mites can develop resistance very quickly. And it's also important to kind of think of the time of the year when you're thinking of monitoring. And again, this is coming from the Honeybee Health Coalition's Tools for Varroa Management Guide. And this is this table will show you that at, you know, certain colony phases is when our Varroa populations might be more dangerous. So for instance, when we're dormant without brood, you tend to see a higher Varroa population. And that's because there's nowhere for the Varroa to hide. They're on the bodies of the bees. And so usually you can get away with having a little bit of a higher mite load. But at peak population, the same kind of thing. Now you've got a big, strong colony and you tend to have, you know, higher Varroa loads, even if the colony is still fairly strong. But once that colony starts to decrease in population size, like I said, during kind of the late summer and the fall, that's when things get really serious. And at about 2 to 3 mites per 100 bees is when you've got to start doing something. You got to take action. Now, there are a few different monitoring strategies. I'm just going to highlight 3. They all serve a purpose. They all have their pros and cons. But I think it's better to do something than to do nothing, or it's better to monitor in some way than to just guess, right? So powdered sugar is a really useful way of getting mites off the bodies of the bees, and this is the big pro for this, is that it's not going to necessarily kill your bees. It's probably not good for your bees, I would say, but they'll probably pull through, and most of them are going to survive this. But all you're doing is you're collecting about 300 bees, which is about a half a cup of bees. And now some of you that are new to beekeeping, you might be really worried. And when I just said you need to collect a half a cup of bees, because Cameron, how am I supposed to do that? You don't need to be a bee expert to know that they probably don't want to be collected like this, right? Well, there are some really good videos online. Actually, the Honeybee Health Coalition has some really great videos on this. It's really not as bad or scary as you might be thinking. It just takes a little bit of practice, but I mean, you can totally do this, so don't get overwhelmed. But if you have a jar, then you can stick a number 8 mesh. That's 1/8 inch of mesh hardware cloth that you can put over this jar. And then you're putting on a couple tablespoons of powdered sugar to this 300 bee sample here. And then you're just going to roll that around for a minute, let it sit for a few seconds. Then you flip it over and gently shake it out, and the mites will start coming out. Now, the con of this is that you really don't know if you've missed some mites because you're not going to go back in there and check when those bees are all sticky and mad at you. So you're kind of just it's a nice way to do a little estimate, but maybe not the most accurate. If you're going for accuracy, which as a researcher, this is what I'm mostly interested in, and I use alcohol washes. So again, we're collecting about 300 bees here, and then we are going to strain that somehow. So we're collecting 300 bees, we're pouring in alcohol. It could be isopropyl alcohol, which is rubbing alcohol. It doesn't even have to be alcohol. It could be, some kind of soapy water, but if you use dish soap, it's going to make your life pretty miserable because you do need to shake this vigorously for about 30 seconds. And that's just trying to dislodge the mites from the bodies of the bees. So you can do, some people use windshield wiper fluid, which is, a soap that is meant to handle shaking and not bubble up. Isopropyl alcohol works great. And that's really nice if you know that you can't get to your samples for maybe a few days, then that's probably the way you want to go. Because if you just do this in water, it's going to be really gross. And it's not going to last for more than a little while without getting really stinky. But what I like to do, there's different ways that you could do this. You could put on this mesh screen and then try to wash it several times and shake it out. What I found that works really well for me is to just have a honey sieve. Most honey sieves are going to come with 2 layers of cloth. One that's going to trap all the bees but let the mites through, and then the second layer will catch all the mites. That's a really easy way for me to just do a quick sample. And then I can now, like I said, this method is used for accuracy. I can recollect my bees. I can wash them a second time, or I can also count the number of bees per Varroa, which will allow me to have a very accurate ratio of number of mites per 100 bees. So the last method I want to share is really the least hands-on method. This is just measuring the natural mite fall, because these mites are crawling on the bodies of the bees. The bees don't like them either. Every once in a while, they're going to get lucky and they're going to be able to smack one of these mites off their bodies, and they're going to fall to the bottom of the colony or to the bottom of the hive. And if you have a sticky board or something that if your colonies are equipped with screen bottom boards, the mite's going to just fall right out of the hive. If you have a sticky board on the bottom, you can catch those mites. Now, I will say you can't just slide in a sticky board right in your solid or on top of your solid bottom board, or else you're going to catch a lot of bees, which would be really sad. But if you put on some of that hardware cloth, just like you found here, then that's usually enough to help the bees so that they don't stick to it. And the pro for this is that it's very hands off. You don't even need to open the colony. The con for this is that you don't get a whole lot of information, because if you don't know the size and the strength of your colony, then you don't know if you really have a problem or not. And the other issue is that we don't really have a great threshold in terms of mite fall, of what constitutes a problem. So there's a lot of researchers from Europe that kind of anecdotally will say, if you see, more than 10 mites per 24 hours, then that's when you have a problem. But that research is not really published, and it's just kind of more anecdotal, but something at least to stick to, or at least to have in your mind. If you see more than about 10 mites showing up on your sticky screen in 24 hours, then you might have a problem. Okay, so we've talked a bit about biology. We talked a little bit about monitoring. Now let's shift gears here, and I want to focus the rest of our time talking about how we actually manage these pests here. So you probably are aware of integrated pest management. This is kind of a thought process and a way of thinking about control that I think is really important. I mean, the whole idea here is we're relying on different tactics. We're starting with the most safe and the least intrusive, least harmful for the environment methods first, and then as needed, we're increasing and going to maybe more dangerous types of activities or control measures. And so to even be able to think about, which method you need to use, you need to be monitoring and consider some controls or consider some thresholds. And this is not, incredibly well worked out for Varroa. I feel like, in some systems it's easy to do this, but it's actually quite difficult to quantify the damage that Varroa can cause, because there are going to be some colonies that are able to handle higher Varroa levels, and so we don't really have a really accurate picture. And what's more is there are some of these methods that we just don't that aren't working for us. Like, for instance, biological controls. That's using one organism to control another organism. At the moment, there's nothing really reliable that we can introduce into our honeybee colony that's going to effectively control Varroa. Mechanical controls, there are some things that are coming down the pike, like hyperthermia, which is when you're heating up the colony, or maybe another example of mechanical control would be like the drone brood removal. There are some things that you can physically do to remove mites, but they're a bit labor intensive, and a lot of beekeepers don't use them. Cultural controls would be, maybe using queen, a resistant stock, such as Russian queens, Minnesota hygienic. There's a whole bunch of different honeybee stocks that are part of just the way you manage your bees that could help to reduce your Varroa population. But by and large, what we as an industry of beekeepers, we are so heavily reliant upon chemical controls that that's just kind of where we're at. And I don't mean that negatively. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. I'm not anti-chemical. In fact, the whole purpose of IPM is that we are using the tools that are going to be most effective, but are the most safe for us. And so that's why we kind of start down low, and then we go to our last resort, which is chemicals. But that's still kind of where we're at for the most part in terms of Varroa management. Now you can see that they are broken up in two sections. You have organic chemicals and synthetic chemicals being your last resort. And the reason for that separation would be that, typically organic chemicals tend to break down more readily in the environment than a synthetic chemical, which tends to last a long time. Now, while we start talking about chemical controls, I need to kind of get up on my soapbox here for just a minute, if you'll allow me. So the very first thing that I need everybody to understand is that just because a chemical is organic does not make it safe, right? That's very much a naturalistic fallacy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about oxalic acid, which is a natural chemical, but it can be quite harsh, not just for the bees, but for you as the applicator as well, if you're not doing things properly. So you need to kind of drop that. We see this all over the place, not just in terms of chemical control, but, even with all the, there's just so many applications of this out there that is actually not necessarily true. Arsenic, for instance, is organic, right? That's a natural compound, but guess what? It is very deadly and it will kill you. So just keep that in mind. The next thing is the label is the law. So this is important. And I'm not going to, pretend for a moment that the label always means you're going to get the best effective control. If you're following the label, that's not always necessarily the case. But what I'll say is the label is the law, and we should be following the label. And if we're finding that using the labeled rate is not effective, then we should seek to change that label. Their label is really important because there has been lots of research that typically goes into this label creation. And if it is ignored, then we're very likely going to hurt our bees. The last thing that I want to preach is that, just because you find one thing that works for you, and maybe it does work the best, that doesn't mean that you should be using it over and over and over and over, because this is kind of what has got us into the mess of Varroa control, where we have so few options, because our good controls were just overused and mismanaged, and mites develop develop resistance quite quickly, as a lot of pests can do. So so we need to remember that we should be rotating our chemical treatments. So let's talk a little bit more about oxalic acid specifically. And as I mentioned, this is something that I've been researching for several years now, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But just as by way of background, this compound is something that is extracted from plants. I mean, we eat it a lot when we eat broccoli. There's like rhubarb is full of oxalic acid. There's lots of things that we consume that has this chemical in it, but it's just, the dose makes the poison, right? You've probably heard that before. So it's all about concentration. So when you concentrate oxalic acid down, then all of a sudden it becomes pretty harsh stuff. This compound has been used for decades in the United States, but typically and historically it has been used by mixing it into a sugar solution that is then trickled on the bees in between the frames. What is, I guess, useful about this compound is that probably because of its short life within the hive, the bees or the mites have not developed resistance to this compound yet. So even though it's been used for a long time, there's still no reports of mite resistance. One method of application for oxalic acid that is becoming more popular throughout the world, especially in the United States, is vaporization. So vaporization, what that means is we are taking a solid, you can see we've got these solid white crystals, we are putting them into a device that is going to heat them, which basically will turn that into a liquid and then to a gas. If you're using pure OA, which is actually against the label, then it would be sublimation, where you were taking it straight from a solid straight to a gas. But according to the label, we are to use oxalic acid dihydrate, and that is going to turn into a liquid first and then into a gas, and it's going to coat the inside of that hive with oxalic acid. So now you need to be really careful. If you choose to do this type of application, you do need to suit up and take proper precautions, because I've had a little bit on my skin. By accident, I've had a little bit kind of get into, breathe it in a little bit through my nostrils, and I was coughing for, a few minutes. This is not easy stuff to work with. So you need to be careful if you're going to do that. And you also need to protect your bees as well, because if you're just pouring in tons of oxalic acid, you're probably going to hurt them. Okay, so according to the EPA label, it states that for use of oxalic acid vaporization, the current legal limit is 1 gram of oxalic acid per brood chamber. Now, I think that's a little bit strange. I've often wondered where they came up with that 1 gram limit. There was some recent research, I guess not that recent anymore, about 5 years ago in the UK, they published some work where they found that 2.25 grams was what was effective at actually controlling Varroa. And so, but nevertheless, when I was setting out to do my research, I wanted to stick with the 1 gram because that is what is legal. Now, there's another method here that's interesting and useful to think about here. This is something that the Italian beekeepers have been swearing by for years, is that they will cause a brood break by caging that queen for a period of about 3 weeks, or about 21 days is from the period it takes from a queen to lay a fertilized egg and for that worker to develop. 21 days. So if you cage that queen for about 24 days, that's enough time for a unfertilized egg for a drone to develop. If you cage a queen that long, then there should be absolutely no brood that is left inside of that colony, right? Well, the idea is if you get rid of all the brood, then where are the mites? They're all over the bodies of the bees, right? So At that point, that's when you can treat. And the idea is in one fell swoop, you should be able to knock down all the mites inside of a colony. So this is something that the Italian beekeepers have been touting for years. I decided to, as part of my PhD research, I decided that I was going to do some of this and test this in the United States, where we did create a brood interruption by caging the queen. And then we used oxalic acid vaporization to see if we could drop those mites. And of course, we wanted to see what this was going to do to the health of our colony. So I decided to set up this robust experiment because I wanted to get to the bottom of this. And so I have a full factorial design. So we're representing every possible combination of events here, right? So we can either cage our queen, and then we can either treat one time, or we can treat 3 times, or treat no time. So the reason, I guess the justification for treating 3 times would be if you do have brood inside of your colony, then you could treat once a week for 3 weeks, and then you should be exposing most of the mites to the treatment. Now that's the thought process for that. So we decided we would do both. So then the other groups where we did not cage that queen, so there was no brood break, but we were still treating with 1 application, 3 applications, or no applications. And so we had 10 colonies set up. So that's 60 hives. And then we actually did a 7th treatment. This was kind of like our positive control. This is the industry standard of Apivar. This is what most beekeepers are using throughout the United States. We also had a 7th group that was just had Apivar, no queen caging, nothing like that, just Apivar. So we actually had 70 colonies total. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details of that of those data. That article is published online. But what I think is probably the most important kind of take-home message is from this figure right here. And I kind of get embarrassed when I show this, because this makes me look like a really bad beekeeper. Because what we're looking at here is the number of surviving colonies by the end of the experiment. So remember that they all started at 10. But over this period of about 3 months, we had some major die-offs, and the one that was hit the hardest was this group where we only caged the queen, where we did not apply any kind of chemical. We just caged that queen, just had that brood break. You can see that they just did not do very well. This is not an effective treatment in Florida, I would say. Especially, we did this experiment in about September, which for Florida means we still have about 3 months of hot, intense weather. But nevertheless, the queens were kind of slowing down, and our colonies just did not recover, and they did really poorly. If you go one step above that, you see that when you compare these two together, when we treated 1 time and when we treated 1 time and caging the queen, our colonies, at best, only half of them survive. So really poor outcome here. When you look at treating 3 times and doing caging the queen, we still see a deduction or reduction in survival when we cage that queen. So probably what you're drawn to the most is one, you probably see Amatraz and say, hey, Amatraz works. Well, good. I will say that our Amatraz colonies far and away looked the best. They all survived. They all did very well. What you might look at here and say, well, the control and treating 3 times were the same. So that must mean that I don't have to do anything. I'm better off not doing anything than treating. Well, that's definitely not the point that I want you to walk away here with. But what I do want you to notice is that, that current legal limit of 1 gram of OA per brood chamber clearly is ineffective, right? So that led us to another experiment the following year where we thought, well, we need to now figure out what is the effective dose that is going to control Varroa. And since we're increasing that dose, we need to obviously see what it's going to do to the colony health. So this time we didn't bother with any of the queen caging, because we saw before that just was not an effective option for us. So we had 4 different groups here where we kept the 1 gram limit, which is the current legal dose. We doubled it to 2 grams, doubled it again for 4 grams, and then we had an untreated control for comparison. So we have our 40 colonies, and this time we kind of ran this experiment over a period of about 1 month, where we sampled before. So we were sampling for Varroa, then we treated once a week, and then just continued to sample. just to kind of observe these mite populations. And we also wanted to see what this was going to do to the strength of the colony. So that's why we were also performing these strength assessments where we were estimating bees, brood, honey, and pollen. Now, here's what we saw, and I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. Here we have on this y-axis, we have our average number of mites per 100 bees. So this is our infestation rate. And here we're looking at our different treatments. So let's first start here with this blue line, our control. So this is the colonies where we did no kind of chemical control. And you can see that from the start to the end of the experiment, our mite populations steadily grew. And that is to be expected, right? We're doing nothing, our mite populations are going to keep growing. When we do our 1 gram treatment, interestingly, we do see a reduction. It's just not very much. It's slowly kind of going down over time, but not a real reduction. In fact, it was, statistically speaking, it was not any different than at the end of the day than our control was. When we look at our 2 gram treatment, we still see an overall reduction in the number of mites, and it is more significant than our 1 gram treatment. But when you compare the two together, there really wasn't much of a difference between the 2 gram and the 1 gram treatment. But there was a very big difference between the 2 gram and the control. So 2 grams seems to be better than doing nothing, right? Now, even better is when we added 4 grams, we see a reduction, a drastic reduction in mites over this 1 month period. And we do see significant differences from the 4 gram treatment to the 1 gram treatment. And so 4 grams seemed to be what was giving us our best control. Now, I want to show you this one little bit of information that we were collecting kind of along with our mite infestation levels was mite fall. And so we were putting in sticky boards. Basically, after we would treat, we'd slide in those sticky boards, and we would watch the number of mites that would just start falling. And you would see that, right when we would treat, we would see those numbers spike. So lots of mites are falling down. But then, a few days after the treatment, you can see that they're all kind of clumped together and not very many mites are falling again. So then we treat the second time, those numbers go up. Then after a few days, those numbers go down again. Same thing, we treat again, the numbers go up, and then the numbers come back down. What I want to show you this for is, you get with the oxalic acid vaporization, you're going to get that initial blast, that initial wave where you are going to drop some mites. The issue I have with using mite fall as a strategy of just estimating your mite populations is that, again, look how they all kind of clump back together when there's not that chemical being applied into the hive. It just kind of tells me that mite fall is not incredibly reliable if that is your only method of monitoring. So I wouldn't recommend that just as your only monitoring strategy. I would much rather you do alcohol washes or powdered sugar shakes so you have a more reliable method there. Now, when we're looking at what this these different treatments did to the overall health of our bees, you kind of actually see the answer is quite simple. Really nothing happens. If we're looking at the number of bees, you can see that for the most part, they're all clumped together and there's no real separation. There was none of these treatments that were different. Same with brood. You can see that there is a general decrease, but we would argue this is more of an effect of the season, given our control is doing the exact same thing. And we performed this experiment kind of in September again. So which is when the colony or the queens are starting to slow down their rearing, their egg laying. With honey, you can see honey, they stay mostly flat. Same with pollen, they're mostly flat. There was no difference in no significant differences amongst any of the treatments for any of these parameters, which kind of leads me to think that oxalic acid at 2 to 4 grams is a better, when you vaporize it, it's going to give you a better control, and it's also more or less, it's going to be safe, at least from the parameters that we can conclude from this study. There's no immediate effects on the overall queen health. There have been some other work that has shown that oxalic acid can potentially affect queens down the road. But even that, I don't think are incredibly conclusive. So I would urge you to be safe. And like I said, the label is the law, and so I need everybody to look into my eyes really quick, just so you know that you're understanding me correctly here. I'm not telling you that you should go out and start vaporizing 4 grams, right? That's illegal. I work for the state of Florida. I can't really say that. I wouldn't say that. What I'm telling you is that we're hoping to use these data along with some other projects that we're hoping to do in collaboration with other researchers across the country to support the EPA to encourage the EPA to change that label. I want this to be legal. I want this to be effective for beekeepers, and I want to do this the right way. So we do still have a bit of future work that needs to take place. Since the highest dose we tested was 4 grams, and it didn't really have an effect. So I think in the future, I'm still going to need to figure out, what that high dose threshold is. Like at what point is it too much, and you actually do start really hurting your bees. And also, as I preached the IPM earlier, it's really going to be important to integrate multiple control methods. So one last thing, I just wanted to say that, we're focusing pretty heavily on the chemical control, and because that has been giving us our best control thus far, but we have so few options that a lot of researchers right now are investing heavily in searching for new chemical controls. And I'm right there with them. And this is a big part of the research that I'm currently doing, where we've got to test it on our mites, but we also have to test it on the bees, because even if we find something that's incredibly toxic to mites, it doesn't do us any good if it's also very toxic to our bees as well. So it's been a difficult balance to find good candidates, and it can take a while for testing. So I hope that everybody will be patient with us as we're trying to work on these issues. So just in conclusion, I want you to make sure that you remember to monitor your Varroa levels, be cognizant and aware of the treatments that you're using and the timing. Use different techniques throughout the year to control Varroa, not just chemicals. And if you are going to use your chemical controls, be sure that you're rotating. And I also want to just point out, even if we find something, some new chemical that comes out, there's never going to be a silver bullet for Varroa. It's always going to require, multiple techniques and some good beekeeping management. And so to help you with that, I hope that you will check out this free resource, the tools for Varroa management. It's very helpful. It's got some very specific information about different kinds of treatments. So if you're not using, or if you haven't seen this before, I strongly recommend that you do it. And lastly, I'm a shameless plug here. So I, as an instructor, I teach lots of beekeeping courses. If you're there in Ohio, I know that you have access to great materials, and there are other extension courses available. I teach university students as well. And so if you're in need of some credits from different universities, we have all these courses are available online, and we're hoping to develop a beekeeping certificate program through the University of Florida this upcoming year. So I guess with that, I'm sorry that I'm not available to be there in person, but we can't do that right now during COVID anyways. But that I'm not able to attend live at this time, but I do have my email up here. I want you to feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the research, or offer any help that I possibly can. So I guess with that, I'll stop talking, and thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing from some of you.